Hi, my name is Sarah Daba. I'm a board member of the SCA, and we're excited to bring you this event tonight. We thought it would be a great idea. Actually, my sister Allie, who's here, thought it would be a great idea, shout out, to do some kind of a talk where we can discuss the different situations that we all find ourselves in the workplace and in college. It's not so easy to talk about Israel on the internet. It's even harder to do it with your own boss and your coworkers. So we brought on the professional tonight. We have Brandon here from AJC. Brandon's the associate director, and this is his wheelhouse. The AG, I'll let you speak to a little bit more about what the AJC does, but basically, like, they're a resource for anyone that needs help in this area. They do these trainings all the time. This is their specialty, and we thought this was the perfect time to bring them in. I guess Brandon's going to walk through the presentation, then we're going to take a couple of questions at the end and just go over any specific situations that anyone here wants to talk about. I think that's all from me now. I'll hand it to you, Brandon.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Irene, for organizing this, and happy to be with all of you as SCA tonight. And we'll dive in, and we'll talk a little bit about AJC. I'll cover some of the common definitions and misconceptions and tropes and misinformation that we're hearing. And then we'll talk about best practices and really how to navigate the workplace and how to speak about these issues there. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll dive into the presentation. Okay. So first of all, I work for American Jewish Committee, AJC. AJC is a 118-year-old organization that was founded here in New York to combat anti-Semitism. That was our foremost priority, and the organization has grown and evolved over the years. And so we have three main priorities that we work on: combating anti-Semitism, supporting Israel, and promoting democratic values for all. And so as you see here, our mission statement is to enhance the well-being of the Jewish people and of Israel. And so the way that AJC works is we are a global advocacy organization for the Jewish people. We have 25 offices across the United States, basically in all the main Jewish population centers, 14 offices across the world, including our newest one in the Emirates in Abu Dhabi. And we have over 38 relationships with local Jewish communities throughout the diaspora, different countries. And so AJC, we do our advocacy by working with diplomats. So we work with diplomats here in New York City. A lot of the work that I do focuses on working with diplomats at the United Nations and with consulates here. We work with leaders across the world in the diplomatic sphere, so prime ministers, presidents, with elected officials, local, state, and federal elected officials, and different non-Jewish communities, so different interfaith and intergroup communities. And I want to start off, before we dive into the nitty and gritty, to speak about what anti-Semitism is. And so this definition that you see in front of you is the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition on anti-Semitism. And this definition, which AJC helped form back in the early 2000s, helped to really explain what anti-Semitism is across the world and to provide a definition for all. So this is the standard working definition on anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And so this definition has been adopted by over 30 countries across the world, including the United States State Department. It has been adopted by several cities across America. So there's many city councils that have adopted it, many universities that have adopted it, and corporations, organizations, you name it, across the world that have adopted this definition. And so it is a very important definition. And really the definitive one that the mainstream Jewish community and that AJC uses. And it's very connected to anti-Zionism. As I'm sure you all know, anti-Zionism crosses over into anti-Semitism very often, and particularly after October 7th, the lines between, you know, anti-Semitism and this vitriol anti-Israel rhetoric and anti-Semitism are, we can see through it now much easier. And so within this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition on anti-Semitism are many examples of when anti-Zionism crosses into anti-Semitism. And you see the definition here, calling for Israel's destruction, for Israel to not exist. People do not call for any other country in the world to not exist. This is one example of when this criticism of Israel crosses over into anti-Semitism. Examples of demonizing and delegitimizing Israel, comparing Israel to Nazis, saying it is creating concentration camps, things like that. The IRA working definition, the IHRA working definition would consider these things to be anti-Semitic. So now I want to dive into speaking about some of the different tropes that we're all hearing and some of the disinformation out there and this misinformation that we're seeing. Here I've provided two examples of rhetoric that I'm sure you've all seen, whether it's in the news from different news sources or on social media, and, you know, around New York City, unfortunately, as well. So you see the definition of what a genocide is, and of what apartheid is, and how these words have kind of become buzzwords, right? That they're very supercharged with meaning. They have connotations, very negative connotations attached to them, and that these words are thrown out, you know, allegations against Israel during this conflict, and they bring up powerful memories, and it's a very serious accusation. So we'll talk about more of this as we're going through this and to how to debunk these things. But I want to provide some examples of things that I'm sure you've seen in the news, and beyond just genocide and apartheid, some of the things that we're seeing and how we can then, after we identify these things, how we can best combat it. So if you remember in the beginning of the war, there was a bombing of the Al-Shifa hospital, and it was immediately blamed on Israel by Hamas. And the world seemingly 100% believed a terrorist organization, and very much you see on the New York Times was saying that it was Israel's fault. We know that it was not Israel's fault. You'll see in the red, these are things that AJC and other organizations have worked on to make corrections and show what the truth actually is. And if you've read the news, even in the past couple days, some leaders of the terrorist group Palestinian Islamic Jihad that were arrested recently in Gaza City even admitted that Palestinian Islamic Jihad bombed the hospital. So these are the accusations and the blaming of Israel without any factual information that we're facing. And we see, you know, different tropes here as well, that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. I explained, you know, why that is extremely problematic. And you've all seen and hopefully not experienced chants of "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And what that really is calling for is the destruction of Israel, right? From the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, that will all be Palestine. That leaves no room for a Jewish state of Israel. And, you know, anyone that thinks that that would be a situation in which the 7 million Jewish Israelis could live and coexist is very naive. We saw at least what Hamas, when in power, and what they would want to do, and we don't have to go far to see their rhetoric, right? That they wish to destroy not only the Jewish state, but Jews worldwide. So, and we talked about it as well, about this demonization of Israel, comparing them to Nazis, as you see in the one photo. These are some of the things that we're seeing that are very much moving from not just criticism of Israel, like we can have criticism of different policies, but when you are specifically calling for the destruction of a territory of a people, this is anti-Semitic. So, going to the genocide narrative, this is some of the examples that we've seen, that Israel is committing genocide, and the shrinking, if you will, of this map, which is very, it evokes obviously feelings when you see that the land is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. What it is not entailing, of course, and we'll talk about more, is all the peace deals and all the rejection that has come from the peace process. But, again, this rhetoric of Israel committing genocide is extremely worrisome, and something that we need to continue to fight back and push up against. So there's also this rhetoric of a ceasefire, and that there's been no attempts at a peaceful two-state solution, which we just spoke about as well. And we're hearing more and more, in my own line of work with diplomats, of more and more diplomats and more of the international community calling for a unilateral ceasefire or permanent ceasefire. And these things are also very scary for Israel, because Israel needs to fight against Hamas, an organization, again, that has dedicated itself to destroying the state of Israel. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we can combat some of these, how we can combat some of these different lies and allegations that are being leveled at Israel. So when we're talking about the claims of genocide, I think it's very important first to also speak about why there is a war. There was a war because on the morning of October 7th, Hamas violated a previous ceasefire that was already in existence with Israel, came across the border, and as we know, murdered, mutilated, raped, and burned 1,200 people. And Israel is fighting a war of self-defense, and the international community would agree with that. These claims of genocide, this is playing into what Hamas wants also. Israel is doing everything it can in a very dense urban environment to protect civilians. We have to also understand, again, that Hamas is a terrorist organization that does not care about the Palestinian people, and in fact is cynically using them as human shields, right? Hamas has its arms, its own terrorist army taking control of mosques, of UN schools and hospitals, and that Hamas is hiding in these facilities that are a blatant violation of international law. And we know that Hamas has stolen billions of dollars, and whereas it put that money, it hasn't put it into civilian infrastructure. It's taken it underground, and they're hiding in their tunnels. And so Israel is operating in this kind of environment in which, unfortunately, it's not so clear cut when Hamas is hiding within civilian infrastructure. I think this isn't like a war in the Middle Ages where we're meeting on the battlefield of two armies. It is asymmetrical, and so I believe Israel is doing everything it can to minimize casualties. We know that within the different units of the IDF, before there's an airstrike, there's actually lawyers that are called to make sure that everything that the IDF is doing is in terms of international law. And so really pushing back against these claims of genocide is important. It's an allegation that is completely unfounded. There are over 2.2 million people in Gaza, and we regret, and every civilian death is a tragedy, but there's been 33,000 deaths if we're holding Hamas to the numbers that it's saying, which have to be taken with a grain of salt. But we know from the Israeli authorities that about 12 or 13,000 are terrorists. So those are the numbers of where we're at. And I think, again, it's really important to claim that in Israel is now doing more humanitarian aid. It is trying to support Gaza while also fighting a war. And that's a very important distinction to make. And this claim and allegation of apartheid within Israel, I'll just briefly mention, I think, as you all know, and many of you, I assume, have been to Israel several times like myself, and you see on the light rail in Jerusalem, you see Jews and Arabs together, Muslims, Christians, and Jews together in this multi-ethnic, multiracial liberal society. We have Ethiopian, Mizrahi, Sephardi, Ashkenazi Jews from all over the world in Israel. You have different Christian communities, you have Druze communities, Muslim communities, all coexisting within Israel. You have Arab parties that are represented in the Knesset, parties that are even against many aspects of the state, participating in this democracy. And again, these claims, they're supercharged words, but we need to be able to combat them and to tell people that this is totally wrong. And so these are some of the things that were that are really important to say to people and to make very clear, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I want to talk about some of the other issues that we're seeing really in the news cycle right now. There is this call for a permanent ceasefire. Many of you have probably seen this, and accusations that Israel is pro-war. And what's important, again, is that a permanent ceasefire today, what that would mean is that's leaving Hamas in power. And Hamas staying in power, Hamas has stated that it wants to do October 7th again and again and again. And if we hold them at their word, then how can there be a peaceful way forward a day after in which there can be some sort of better day for both Israel and for Palestinians? With Hamas in power, that can't exist. Their sole existence is predicated on destroying Israel and killing Jews. So that's why it's so important that Israel continues its war aims of both releasing the hostages and of dismantling Hamas's ability to govern and be fully operational within Gaza. And a claim also that Israel doesn't want peace and that Israel wishes to obliterate Gaza is totally unfounded. We know that Israel has extreme military power and is obviously being very targeted in what it is doing in Gaza and being very careful. And we know that throughout the entire peace process, we don't need to go through every single attempt, but even starting before the state in 1937, 1948, during the Oslo period in the early 2000s, there's been several attempts, all spurred and initiated by Israel to try to create a two-state solution. And all of these peace deals have been rejected. And so Israel's doing the best it can, but Palestinian rejectionism is preventing, is perpetuating the conflict. And so this is a point that we need to make, and to be clear that Israel continues to put itself out there. In fact, even today and yesterday, Israel is trying, and with support of the United States, trying to secure a hostage deal, and Hamas continues to reject it. So Israel is agreeing to temporary ceasefires for the release of hostages, but Hamas seemingly doesn't care about its people, and feels that it somehow has the high ground and wants to continue this war without a temporary ceasefire. And this is an important thing to note as well. So this is, I want to switch now to advice for how we engage about the war, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the workplace. And this is findings that have been done by different organizations that have done real surveys and used real quantitative research that explain how best to support Israel and talk about the story of Israel in the workplace, in the non-Jewish community, with leaders, and across the United States. So one important thing is to keep Hamas's atrocities in focus, right? This war wouldn't be happening if October 7th didn't happen. And October 7th happened because Hamas perpetrated it. So this is an important piece to keep in mind. And Hamas is to blame for the continuation of the war. I have it down here, you can refer to statements by the US administration. We're all Americans. I think hearing from the US leadership is very important. And Secretary of State Blinken said that this war would have ended on October 8th, yesterday, today, tomorrow. It will end if Hamas would surrender, hand over its guns, and release all the hostages. But those things have not happened. So while much of the international community wants to place singular blame on Israel, it's very important to keep in mind Hamas is the perpetrator. Hamas is who started this, and Israel is the victim in this scenario that is fighting back in a war of self-defense. I think it's important to also present the facts while also having empathy for all. Being pro-Israel doesn't mean that we of course grieve any loss of innocent life, but this is a war, again, that Israel is fighting in self-defense, and Hamas is hiding, cowardly behind tunnels and putting civilians at risk. And that is something that we have to keep bringing to the forefront. We also know that, I'm sure you're all on social media as well, that the personal stories, the emotional element is really important. I myself know people. I was closely connected to those, to people that were murdered on October 7th. And in our small Jewish community, I'm sure there's only 1, 2, or sometimes no degrees of separation between what happened on October 7th and how that affects our family and friends and our networks. And bringing those stories is really important. Speaking about the fact that today there's still 80,000 Israelis in the north that had to evacuate their homes in Ma'alot, in Kiryat Shmona and other areas, Rosh Hanikra, that they had to flee because Hezbollah continues to shoot rockets at Israel's northern border, and that there are internal refugees within Israel. Those are things to continue to bring to the forefront. Now to speak about how we navigate some of these conversations in the workplace. So I think it's really important that when we're having these conversations, always speak calmly and politely. How you say your point matters as much as what you say. So if you start screaming, you will be seen as a fanatic or a radical in some ways. So just remain even-keeled. I myself, I understand that these are obviously really tense times for us all, but it's important to keep calm and to present the side in an eloquent and articulate way. And you can use I statements, when you're at work, particularly saying like, this is how I feel, and really also explaining your own personal piece to this. I think that is really important. And for this piece, when you're also navigating in the workplace, we can talk about political issues within the conflict and those kinds of things, but there is a reality here as Americans living in the United States that anti-Semitism has increased. We know that anti-Semitism has increased here in the United States and in New York City in particular. And I live in Ocean Parkway here in Brooklyn, and we all know also that here in Brooklyn, in this neighborhood, in Borough Park, Crown Heights, other areas of Flatbush, that those that are identifying as visibly Jewish are at the forefront here of facing overt anti-Semitism. And there is no excuse for that, full stop, that whatever happens thousands of miles away in a conflict, American Jews are not to blame. And explaining how you feel at a situation at work, and if you feel that something is crossing that line into anti-Semitism, you should definitely share it. Um, and on this piece, I would also say, if you feel that certain rhetoric is anywhere amounting to a threat or to danger in any way, you should definitely be in touch with your HR department, and with HR in general. And you should also know that AJC, we work very much in this space. We work in the corporate sphere. We do different trainings, as I'll mention later as well. And so you can always reach out to myself, and AJC. And it's important that you know when to walk away and to disengage in a conversation, and maybe when even a conversation isn't going to be helpful. At AJC, we're a nonpartisan organization. We meet with elected officials across the political spectrum, but we know that there are certain people on the far left and the far right that don't want to hear what we're saying. And we don't want to hear necessarily what they're saying, but they don't want to hear what we're saying. And that, you need to also choose when to engage and when sometimes it's just not worth it. If people aren't going to listen, if they're going to shout at you, if they're, if they are vehemently anti-Israel and won't even communicate with you, it's best not to engage. And it's also important to know when you can just walk away. And I would also say you don't need to be an encyclopedia of every single fact that exists about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to speak about these issues. Again, speaking from your own perspective, I would hope that all of your coworkers very much respect you, and respect your work, and who you are, and you can speak to them about how you are feeling. And of course, if there's any questions that you have, you can look them up or what have you. But it's also okay to not know every single piece. And there's so much happening, and the situation is changing constantly. So I want to put that in there as well. And so what can you do? First, I think you should have these conversations at work, where it's appropriate. You should have these different conversations. There are different ways to also bring it up at work. Many larger companies have now a diversity, equity, inclusion office. Maybe it's within HR or their own DEI office. And within the DEI sphere, AJC is working very hard to make sure that Jews are a part of that conversation. That we know that Jews are a minority group in the United States. Only 2% of Americans identify as Jewish. Yet, according to FBI statistics, over 50% of hate crimes are religious-based hate crimes are against Jews. So it's very important that we have our space within DEI sphere, in the business world, in the corporate world, and in the workplace in general. And so there are different things that you can do there. You can ask to do a training about combating anti-Semitism. As I have listed here, again, AJC, we've done corporate trainings across so many different fields, whether it's law, finance, medicine, working with hospitals, tech, startups, you name it, we've done it. And so bringing in anti-Semitism trainings is really helpful. Just educating people about the Jewish community is really helpful. And not only in terms of negative things, in terms of combating hatred, but a plug for next month is May is Jewish American Heritage Month. And this is a time to celebrate how American Jews have integrated into American society and the successes that we have had, and our pride in being American and Jewish. So many companies have made statements in support of Jewish American Heritage Month. And as we know, many companies will make statements about Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, Black History Month, International Women's History Month. So there are different precedents for this, and we should be included in that conversation. You can always ask questions, I think, of coworkers, in a safe space, or in a place where you feel comfortable. You can ask them questions. You can explain your own views. You can help spread accurate information. And you can engage those people that want to engage you. Many people after October 7th think that they're an expert on the Middle East, but most of us are not. And having some of those challenging conversations can be helpful if people are receptive to it. I say this for myself too, but taking a social media break and just a media break in general, there's a lot out there. And in this war in particular, there's a lot of misinformation. So, take your own breaks and focus on yourselves as well, and lean on your Jewish community, right? So you have SCA here, you have AJC and others. So it's always good to be among family, and to lean in on your community. And with that, I am all very open to hearing questions from you and discussing some of the issues that perhaps some of you are going through, and would love to open it up for Q&A and discussion. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Brandon, I actually have one that somebody submitted to us in advance. I could just click this off with that one, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. They said, what are some ways to de-escalate a situation with your higher ups? Is there a way to respectfully end the conversation when the person you're speaking to is being very combative and they're also your supervisor? I can't just walk away. What do I do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think these cases, have to be taken on a case-by-case basis in your own relationship with your supervisor and things like that. I think you can explain your point of view. And yes, I mean, in some ways you could say agree to disagree, but I think it's just, you could just say, we can talk about this another time, or we can pick up on these different pieces, or maybe would you read something, this article, or this press release, or this statement by an elected leader that expresses a viewpoint that might be more supportive of Israel. And I think you can lean into some of those different points. There are many that you can take. But these things are also, you have to be very careful if it is a supervisor. So, take that also, and just realize, again, I'm going to keep saying it, but if there's anything that's making you feel unsafe, feel like very much attacked, or things that you think are crossing into anti-Semitism, you need to bring it up with HR, or with whatever powers that be. You don't want to be in an unsafe environment. And it's also your supervisor's duty to not put you in a situation like that. So it's important to report that, and to make sure that, you're not in a situation like that.
Thank you. And then related to that note, I got a second question about HR. What do I do if I don't feel comfortable going to HR? Is there somewhere else, I guess like AJC, for example, where I can go that can help me?
Yeah. Well, I would say, if you are not comfortable going to HR, then that means perhaps this company has some issues that you need to think about, in terms of, like, is this a work environment that you want to stay at? That would be my first piece. And second, yes, definitely you can come to organizations like AJC. There are other Jewish organizations that also specialize in the legal aspects. AJC has legal counsel as well. But there are different organizations that are working on these issues that can support you. HR would be the first place to go. And if you have also a good relationship with whoever is saying these things, people we're just living in a very ignorant world. And sometimes people, what they say is not what they mean. And they might not understand how what they're saying is extremely offensive. And if it's someone that you're close to and feel comfortable with, also explaining why this makes you feel this way is very helpful because some people just don't understand. Um, and that's also where you can do some of these, like I talked about earlier, doing some of these different anti-Semitism trainings and speaking about these things and like who are the Jewish people and explaining a little bit about Jewish history is so important.
Great, thank you. I mean, I don't know if you got any from else, but I have a couple more that we had submitted to us that I think are more general. Okay. Let's see. Okay, you kind of touched on this before, but my company always acknowledges what other minorities are being discriminated against, has sent memos, made policies, implemented programs supporting other groups. They're silent about the current rise in anti-Semitism in our country. What can I do to explain to them this is glaring and hurtful to the Jews in our company?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think this is really where it's important that you do speak up and that Jews do have a seat at this DEI table. Um, we are a minority. We are a persecuted minority here in the United States. And it's important that if companies are taking stances in supports of other minority groups, that they also stand up for the Jewish community. And there's a way to do that also without being political. There's really nothing political about saying a company saying we are against anti-Semitism. We support our Jewish employees that are facing rising anti-Semitism. And there's a way to communicate that to your DEI offices, HR departments, and that they should stand up for the Jewish community and why this is so important. And again, you can bring in different experts, different Jewish organizations, AJC, to speak about these issues. And it's important. And I know many companies since October 7th, they've done, in separate environments, but they have done a combating anti-Semitism, which because we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th. And they might also do a combating Islamophobia workshop. So, okay, we can do these different things, like all different minority groups have a seat at the table. There's also, anti-racism trainings, how to call out anti-Asian hate. And so there shouldn't be anything political also about calling out anti-Semitism. And we need to be forceful here. I think this is really where like our voices need to come up and you need to advocate. Companies might not think themselves to do it. Unfortunately, there's a narrative that Jews in the United States are that we're all white and that we're all privileged. And a colleague of mine says very, very eloquently that the Jews throughout history can be seen as white passing until the non-Jewish society takes that privilege away. And again, as I said, we know that Jews make up the largest portion of religious-based hate crimes. And it's really, really important that we have a seat at this DEI table and that people are learning more about the Jewish community and about what anti-Semitism is.
Thank you. I like what you said about having to be pushy. I think that's definitely true these days. Which is one big one, and then we'll do like an easy one. I feel uncomfortable around many of the people that I work with and have become withdrawn from them. I'm worried this will affect my standing in my job. Are there steps I could take to protect myself so this doesn't work against me in my career?
It's a
A big
great
one.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hard one. I think that I would want to know first the specific examples, but if you're feeling that this environment is very anti-Israel or anti-Jewish, then it might be a place where you can speak to HR about that. That would be what I would say. Um, and that hopefully they can do some sort of sensitivity training, anti-Semitism training. And then also, if your company I don't know what kind of company this is, if it's a very small company or something, if it has this really toxic workplace, then you need to think about if you're actually very happy in this job, if this is the place for you. And that should also be part of the calculation. But Sarah, I want to pick up on what you just said also before this question, which is you have to advocate for yourself. And that is so important that I think as the Jewish community, we need our partners, we need our elected officials, our leaders to represent us. But first and foremost, we have to stand up for ourselves. We need to be our own advocates, and we need to show that confidence and articulation on our own side. And that will also inspire others to stand up for us. But we need to be confident in ourselves, and pride in our own community, in our own well-being, in the state of Israel that is so, important and central to so many of our identities, and to stand up for those pieces. And so to that end, to this question too, I would say that if we can go to the HR department, work with the powers that be to say that, why you're feeling uncomfortable from this political solution and how you can work forward on it.
Great, thank you. And you also mentioned a couple minutes ago about maybe bringing an op-ed or an article, and suggesting like at another time you can read this in your, in your own space and get back to me on what you think. Are there any resources that you recommend that are kind of neutral? Like everything has a spin. What would you suggest is safe to tell someone? Like you can't tell someone, read this article from Fox News, they're gonna laugh at you, or read this article from CNN, they might laugh at you. What's
Yeah.
the middle ground there?
Yeah. Everything nowadays is charged. And we're living in a very polarized country and world. And that's really where I think AJC is a centrist, nonpartisan organization. And we, I really believe in the centrist element here. It is hard to find those places. What I would say is that there are different think tanks that tend to be more centrist, that are well respected, the Institute for Near East Policy, and others in DC that have resources about some of these issues that I can share, and that people can read and look over. I also think that hearing from our elected officials, and 90% of them are staunchly supportive of Israel at this time, and lifting up those voices from elected officials here in New York City and in the local area. Many of us on this call, we have are represented by Yvette Clarke in Congress, or Hakeem Jeffries and others that have been very staunchly pro-Israel, that have went to Israel many times. Lifting up some of those voices as well, I think is very, very important. And so those are the different sources that I would recommend. This one is more biased, but I'm a avid reader of Times of Israel, which I think is a great source. Jerusalem Post, those are good sources as well to hear from an Israeli perspective. And what I would say is, in order to get a balanced perspective, to your point, Sarah, you should both, if you're going to read Fox, read CNN. If you're going to read CNN, read Fox, so you at least get a balance. And I think that's really important. I think that when you can, reading articles that have specific numbers are important. The humanitarian situation, Israel is producing, through the coordination in Gaza and the territories authorities, Kogat, they're producing now every day on social media exactly how many trucks are coming into Gaza. Those are factual figures that you can point to. And when people are talking about humanitarian aid, those are some of the things that you can parse out and that I would recommend.
Thank you. Okay, so Irene said that she submitted a question too that we got from the audience. I think it's in your chat.
Yes.
Okay, so I think
Uh,
that'll be the last one, unless anyone else has anything else, they can send them to Irene through the chat. So I'll let you take it from there.
Sounds good. I'll read the question. What tips would you give someone interviewing with companies to help them realize if it's going to be a healthy and safe environment as a Jewish prospective employee. I think that the questions that you could ask first is just to hear about the work environment of the company, hear about the team culture, and do a little bit of your own research. If this is a larger company, has it made statements in support of the Jewish community in combating anti-Semitism since October 7th? Those are things that are public usually, so you can look them up through a Google search. I think it's also important just from a religious perspective. If you're, if you keep Shabbat, if you keep the holidays, if you observe those holidays, those are questions that you can ask. Can I take off for the holidays? Will you be understanding? Those are questions that will help you gauge if this is a flexible, tolerant, and understanding work environment, to not just to be, supportive of Israel, but to be Jewish. Will they be flexible on things like the holidays? Leaving early on Fridays, things like that. Those are questions that I think you can ask and that you can, see. And obviously, if this is a company also that has, if you know other employees that are Jewish, you should ask them, and you can go about it that way. So that's how I would navigate that.
That's great. Okay. Yeah, I love that idea of asking about the holidays. It's a great way to neutrally get some intel on how they respond. Um,
Exactly.
I don't know if there's any other questions. Irene, did you get anything else? No? Okay. Well, thank you, Brandon. That was awesome. I learned a ton. I work for a Jewish organization. I feel like I'm safe and I still feel like I learned a lot. I guess if anyone has any more questions for Brandon or the AJC, they can reach out to the SCA and we'll connect you. And thank you so much for your time. It was awesome.
Thank you all so
Everyone for
much.
joining.
I'm putting my email in the chat. Feel free to message me. And again, thank you, Irene. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, SCA.